You don't belong in this room. I don't know who let you in, but you need to leave, now." He said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Loud enough that the two junior associates by the window looked up from their laptops. Loud enough that the paralegal who had been refilling the water pitcher froze mid-pour. Loud enough that there was absolutely no mistaking what he meant, or who he meant it for. And Naomi Callender didn't flinch, not even a little. She set her leather folio on the conference table, pulled out the chair at the head. His chair, the chair nobody sat in unless invited, and sat down. What would you do if the person you just humiliated in front of 12 witnesses turned out to be the one who could end your entire career with a single phone call? Not a threat, a fact. A quietly devastating fact that was about to rearrange everything Leonard Stowe had spent 31 years building. If you've ever been dismissed before you even had a chance to speak, if someone has ever looked at you and decided, before you opened your mouth, that you didn't matter, stay with this story. Because this one is for you. Leonard Stowe had been the managing partner of Stowe, Pierce & Halliday for so long that most of the junior staff genuinely believed the firm couldn't exist without him. He had started as an articling student in 1994 in a cramped office on Bay Street in Toronto, worked his way up through 16-hour days and strategic lunches, and a particular talent for making clients feel like they were the only person in the room. By the time he made partner, he had the kind of reputation that preceded him into meetings. By the time he became managing partner, he had stopped bothering to remember the names of support staff. That last detail matters. Leonard was 62 years old. He wore his silver hair like a credential. He drove a black Audi Q8 and kept a second home on Lake Muskoka and had opinions about wine that he shared whether or not anyone had asked. He was not, by his own estimation, a bad man. He was a practical man, a realist. He had built something real, something lasting, and he protected it the way a man protects anything he has spent 30 years bleeding for. He did not think of himself as someone with prejudices. He thought of himself as someone with standards. That distinction is important. It tells you everything about how a man like Leonard is capable of doing what he did on a Tuesday morning in October, in a glass-walled conference room on the 22nd floor, and walking away believing he had done nothing wrong. Naomi Callender was 44 years old and had been a corporate lawyer for 17 years, the last 6 of which she had spent in Calgary, building a boutique practice that specialized in mergers and acquisitions for mid-size energy companies. She was precise, methodical, and had a memory for contract language that her colleagues described as slightly unnerving. She had negotiated 9-figure deals in rooms full of men who hadn't expected her to be the one talking. She had learned, over the years, to arrive early, dress conservatively, and let the work speak before she did. She had also, 6 weeks prior, quietly and confidentially completed the acquisition of a 43% stake in Halliday Capital Group, the investment arm that provided the primary funding structure for Stowe, Pierce & Halliday. The deal had been brokered through a numbered holding company and had not yet been announced publicly. The firm's senior partners were aware. The board was aware. The announcement was scheduled for the following week. Leonard Stowe was aware he had received the briefing document. His assistant had confirmed receipt. He had simply never read past the first paragraph. If you're thinking that seems like an unusual oversight for a man of his supposed acumen, you're not wrong. But here is what 31 years of unchallenged authority does to a person. It makes them feel like the important information will always find its way to them. It makes them feel like they don't need to look. The mountain doesn't go to the meeting. The meeting comes to the mountain. Leonard had stopped going to the meeting a long time ago. The morning it happened, Naomi had arrived at the Stowe, Pierce & Halliday offices at 8:15. She had a 9 o'clock with 3 of the senior partners to begin the formal transition briefing. A conversation about what her stake in Halliday Capital would mean for the firm's governance structure going forward. It was, in her estimation, a routine meeting. Significant, yes, but routine. She had been in dozens of rooms like this one. She introduced herself to the receptionist, a young woman named Paige, who smiled and offered coffee and showed her to the conference room on the 22nd floor. Naomi was early. That was intentional. She liked to be in the room before it filled up. She was reviewing notes on her iPad when Leonard walked in at 8:52. He stopped in the doorway. There were two other people already seated: David Pierce, who was one of the named partners, and who had been copied on every communication related to the acquisition, and a woman named Christine Obi, who was the firm's director of strategic development, and who had been instrumental in facilitating the deal from the Halliday side. Christine gave Naomi a small, settled nod. David was scrolling through something on his phone and did not look up. Leonard looked at Naomi. Naomi looked at Leonard. "Can I help you?" he said. His tone was the tone of a man who had never in his professional life been asked to account for his tone. "I'm fine, thank you," Naomi said pleasantly, and returned to her notes. Leonard walked to his usual seat, the one at the head of the table, the one that was understood to belong to him. The way the corner office was understood to belong to him. The way the reserved parking spot in the underground was understood to belong to him, and found it occupied. He looked at the chair. He looked at Naomi. He looked at the chair again. "That's my seat," he said. "I'll move when the room fills up," she said. "Right now there's plenty of space." A lesser man might have read something in that moment. A more careful man. A man who had perhaps glanced at the briefing document sitting in his email since October 3rd. But Leonard Stowe was neither lesser nor more careful. He was simply accustomed to being obeyed, and the experience of not being obeyed, especially by a woman he did not recognize in his conference room, sitting in his chair, produced in him a very particular kind of cold fury that he had never learned to manage. He pulled out the chair to her left, and sat down with the deliberate control of a man who is choosing not to make a scene while simultaneously making a scene. "I don't know who you are," he said, "or who authorized you to be in this room, but I'd like to see some identification before we go any further." Naomi looked at him with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite pity. It was something calmer than either. "I'm Naomi Callender," she said. "I believe you received the briefing package from Halliday Capital 6 weeks ago." "Halliday Capital sends people to my partner meetings." "Halliday Capital," she said, "has a new principal stakeholder." "That's me." "I believe that was outlined in the briefing document." There was a brief silence. David Pierce put his phone down. Christine Obi was very still. Leonard laughed. It was not a kind laugh. It was the laugh of a man who has decided to treat the thing in front of him as an inconvenience, a misunderstanding, something to be managed by the people who manage misunderstandings so that he doesn't have to. "I've been running this firm for over 30 years, he said. "I think I would know if there had been a material change to the ownership structure of our primary funding partner. I think someone would have mentioned that to me." "Someone did," Christine Obi said, very quietly, from across the table. The briefing document was sent on October 3rd. I followed up by email on the 10th. Your assistant confirmed receipt. Leonard looked at Christine as if seeing her for the first time. Christine was 41 years old, black, and had an MBA from Rotman and 15 years in corporate finance. She had worked with Leonard for 6 years. He had never once, in 6 years, learned her last name. "I'm sure there's been some miscommunication," Leonard said, and turned back to Naomi. "What exactly is it you think you're here to do?" "I'm here for the transition briefing," Naomi said. "As a 43% principal stakeholder in Halliday Capital, I have governance input on any firm that receives primary funding through Halliday's structure. That includes this one. That's outlined in the partnership agreement your firm signed in 2019. The partnership agreement with Halliday Capital is between this firm and Halliday Capital. Not between this firm and—" He paused, and the pause was worse than whatever word he was considering. "Whoever the new owner happens to be. That's not how it works," Naomi said. "I'm a lawyer," Leonard said. "I know how it works. So am I," Naomi said. The room had gotten very quiet. There were now 4 other people in it. 2 associates who had come in during the exchange and were doing their professional best to appear invisible, and a paralegal named James, who was standing near the side credenza, with a stack of folders, and the expression of someone who has just realized they're watching something that will be discussed for a very long time. "I don't know what firm you're from," Leonard said, "or who sent you here, or what you were told, but I assure you that this is not the appropriate channel for whatever concern you're looking to raise. My assistant can book you a call with our client liaison team for Mr. Stowe. It was David Pierce. He said it the way you say someone's name when you are trying to stop them from driving off a cliff. Leonard looked at him. She's the one, David said carefully. Naomi Callender, the acquisition through Blackstone North Holdings, the briefing document. That's her. There was a moment, and people who were in that room have described this moment specifically, have described it with a particular kind of detail that suggests it burned itself into their memory, where something moved across Leonard Stowe's face. A flicker of recognition. The briefest, most fleeting moment of connection between what he had dismissed and what was actually true. His ego killed it before it could reach his mouth. If that's the case, he said with a kind of rigid dignity that was rapidly becoming its own indictment, then I'd like our legal team present before this conversation continues. This is highly irregular, and I'm not comfortable proceeding without. Your legal team, Naomi said, is represented in this room by Christine Obi, who facilitated the due diligence on the Halliday side, and by myself, and by the partnership agreement you signed in 2019, which I have a copy of here. She tapped the leather folio. I'm happy to wait while you bring additional counsel, but I want to be clear about something, Mr. Stowe. She looked at him with that same unhurried steadiness that had been in her eyes from the moment he walked in. This meeting was scheduled 6 weeks ago. You were notified. Your partners were notified. I drove here from Calgary, and I've been in this building since 8:15 this morning. I am not the miscommunication. I am the meeting. Nobody in that room made a sound. If you've ever been in a room where the air changes, where something shifts so completely that the people around you are suddenly very busy not looking at each other, you know what the next 20 minutes felt like. Leonard Stowe did not leave. That would have required a kind of self-awareness that was not, at that point, available to him. Instead, he sat very straight and said very little while David Pierce and Christine Obi walked Naomi through the governance implications of the acquisition, with the brisk efficiency of two people who had been waiting 6 weeks for this meeting, and were not going to let another minute of it be wasted. What had happened, and what became clear in that room, was this. When Naomi Callender's holding company had acquired the 43% stake in Halliday Capital, it had triggered a clause in the 2019 partnership agreement that gave the principal stakeholder of Halliday a seat on the firm's advisory board and consultation rights on any compensation decisions above a certain threshold, including, for example, the renewal of the managing partner's contract, which was due for review in February. Leonard's contract renewal, the one that the full board would vote on in 4 months, the one that Naomi Callender would now have input on. The paralegal James later told a colleague that you could see the exact moment Leonard understood. Not the moment he was told. That had been 6 weeks ago, and he had not read it. The moment he understood. His face did something complicated, and then went very, very still. After the meeting, Naomi stayed behind to go over some documentation with Christine Obi. The associates had filed out. David Pierce shook Naomi's hand at the door and thanked her for her patience, which is a specific kind of apology that professional people sometimes offer when a direct one is too complicated. Leonard Stowe left without speaking to anyone. He drove to his Muskoka property that afternoon. His assistant later said he canceled everything for the rest of the week, which was unusual, because Leonard was not the type to cancel anything. He was the type who showed up and expected things to arrange themselves around his arrival. The board meeting was called for November, not February, November. 3 weeks away. One of the other named partners, a woman who had been with the firm for 22 years, and had been passed over for managing partner twice in favor of Leonard, submitted a formal request to move the contract review timeline forward. She cited in her request concerns about the firm's leadership culture and its impact on key external relationships. The request was granted. Leonard hired a lawyer, an outside lawyer, someone not connected to the firm, which tells you something about how clearly he understood, by that point, that the people inside the firm were no longer in his corner. There's something that happens when a person who has never been held accountable is suddenly, unavoidably accountable. Some people, when they reach that moment, find something in themselves. Some grace, some humility, something that lets them meet the moment honestly. Leonard Stowe was not one of those people. His lawyer sent a letter arguing that the governance clause in the 2019 partnership agreement had not been properly disclosed at the time of signing, that the acquisition through a numbered holding company constituted a lack of transparency, and that Leonard's position as managing partner was protected under the terms of his existing contract. The letter used a great deal of sophisticated language. It was, in the assessment of the 3 separate lawyers who reviewed it on behalf of the firm, not a strong argument. Naomi responded through her own counsel. The response was 4 pages. It was, by all accounts, thorough. The board met on November 14th. Leonard was not in the room. The vote on the managing partner renewal was 3-1 against. The dissenting vote was Leonard's own proxy, filed through his lawyer. It was, in the end, the only vote cast in his favor. David Pierce called him that evening to tell him. Leonard listened without speaking, said thank you. Apparently, and this is the detail that people find most striking, said thank you and ended the call. Naomi Callender was not at the board meeting either. She had flown back to Calgary the day after the October meeting and had spent the intervening weeks doing what she always did, working methodically on the things she could control. She sent a brief email to Christine Obi the morning after the vote. It said, "Thank you for everything you did to make this process run cleanly. I know it wasn't easy." Christine told a friend later that she had read that email 3 times. Not because it was surprising, because it was so completely, quietly unlike anything she had been made to feel in 6 years at that firm. That's the thing about a person like Naomi. The story isn't really about what Leonard did. Everyone in that room had seen something like what Leonard did, in one form or another. The story is about what Naomi didn't do. She didn't perform her authority. She didn't explain herself when he questioned her presence. She didn't raise her voice when he laughed. She did not at any point ask him to believe in her. She simply waited for the truth to arrive because she knew it would, because she had built something real and the real things hold. There's a lesson in that. About patience, yes, about preparation, but mostly about what it looks like to know your own worth so completely that you don't need the room to confirm it. Leonard Stowe needed the room. He had needed it for 31 years. He had arranged his entire life around rooms, confirming what he believed about himself. And when one room, on one October morning, refused to do that, when one woman sat in his chair and waited, he had nothing left to reach for. Christine Obi was named interim managing partner in December, pending a full search process. She accepted the role with the same directness she had brought to everything else. When a journalist from the Globe and Mail reached out for comment about the firm's leadership transition, she declined an interview. She sent a 2-sentence statement instead. The second sentence was, "We are focused on building a firm that reflects the values we want to be known for, not the ones we've inherited." Naomi, for her part, did not comment publicly on any of it. She had never needed to. There is a particular kind of strength that doesn't announce itself, that doesn't need the acknowledgement, doesn't need the apology, doesn't need to watch the person who wronged it lose everything in real time. It simply builds and endures and lets the truth arrive on its own schedule. That's not a weakness. That is the most precise and devastating form of power there is. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself in any part of it, in the silence of the associates or the steadiness of Naomi, or the 6 years Christine Obi spent in a firm that never learned her last name, then you already understand why it matters. Not because it's unusual, but because it isn't. These rooms exist. These conversations happen. Every day, in offices from Halifax to Vancouver, there are people who are dismissed before they open their mouths, who are asked to prove what should never have been in question, who carry their credentials into spaces that were built to make them invisible. And most of them don't have 43% of anything. Most of them just have themselves. Which is, in the end, what Naomi had too, before the acquisition and the holding company and the governance clause. She had herself. Precisely, unapologetically, completely herself. That was always the thing Leonard couldn't read in the briefing document. If you're watching from somewhere in this country, from a hospital break room in Winnipeg, or an apartment in Montreal, or a kitchen table in Halifax, and this story found something in you, leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us what you saw in Naomi that you recognize. And if you know someone who needs to hear this one today, share it with them. That's how these stories travel. That's how they do their work. We'll see you in the next one.